Welcome to the Labour Force. I am Bongeni Muchwa. South African Airways is set to return to the skies 2 weeks from now. It will do so under the control of its new private owners, the Takatso Consortium, which has acquired a 51% stake in the national flag carrier for a sum of 3.5 billion rand. The privatisation of SAA has given impetus to government's commitment to carry out economic reforms necessary to increase private sector investment in the economy in order to achieve high levels of economic growth and boost job creation. Now, Transnet has invited expressions of interest from private investors as it seeks to raise billions of rand to improve the country's port and rail infrastructure. And plans are underway to find private investors willing to buy a stake in the cash-strapped state arms manufacturer Denel, where workers have their backs against the wall, having to go without salaries for many months now. With the privatization train now firmly on the move, the question is, has the Labour Federation COSATU lost its decades-long fight against the privatization of state assets? To answer that question, we are joined by COSATU Spokesperson Sizwe Pamla, who, of course, is a familiar face on the show. Somlomo Baba, thank you very much for again making the time to talk to us. The question is very simple. Are you prepared to concede that you have lost the privatization fight, as it were?
No, not at all. We have not lost the privatization fight. We are clear. We still insist that strategic sectors of the economy should not be privatized, but should be left at the hands of government. If you look at the SAA question, for an example, of course, we were taken aback to realize that government decided to hand over 51% of its stake to the private sector. But also, you have to understand the SAA question differently. While we do agree the airline was privatized, but you also have to acknowledge that it was also resuscitated. When you represent workers who were seated at home for 18 months without salaries, and then a solution is found to get them back to work, of course, you will have to concede and accept the fact that it is better for those workers to be back at work. We still remain unhappy with the lack of consultation. We believe that we should have been properly consulted. Our affiliated unions should have been properly consulted. But we also have an economic reconstruction and recovery plan where we have talked about the private sector investment strike. And we have been urging the private sector to release some money back into the economy. In so doing, we do expect that in some situations and instances, there is going to be some partnerships with government. What we don't want is for Labour to be excluded when those partnerships are discussed. We do want the private sector to come on board, invest the money. What we don't want is for unilateralism to be used by government to determine who invests where and how that investment is going to be managed.
Forgive me, but it sounds to me like that's as good as a concession, that as things stand now with regards to the struggling SOEs, it has become abundantly clear to everyone that there is no other viable alternative to resuscitate them, to use your own words, or to keep them alive so as to save the jobs of the workers and to possibly grow them and create more jobs than to bring in the private sector. And that's a definition of privatization of state assets.
Not necessarily, no. For an example, let's go back to the state of the SOEs now. We agree many of them are imploding, they are collapsing. We have to be honest in terms of addressing the question of inefficient public ownership. We have seen it being discussed at platforms like the Zondo Commission, for an example. And we need to confront that, the issue of inefficient public ownership. But our position is that you can tap into the resources that the private sector has to work with the private sector. There is a difference between public-private partnership and privatization. Those are not the same. You can partner with the private sector to fix problems as you see them. And you can hand over everything to the private sector. That is not the same thing. Partnering with the private sector to find a practical, workable solution to fix the problems is something different to just saying you are handing over everything to the private sector, which is why
I think the model that government is following here is very clear now, where they talk about securing a strategic equity partner, which is what happened with SAA. 51% gone to private owners now. Government is looking at the same thing, same model for Denel. They are looking at getting a strategic equity partner. We'll see the percentages when they come out once they announce that. Now we have Transnet inviting expressions of interest. What is your, do you support those moves specifically at Denel and at Transnet at the moment?
Well, we have expressed ourselves on Transnet. We remain opposed to the unbundling of Transnet because we really believe that they are just creating a conducive environment for them to end up privatizing. On Transnet, we have been very clear. We issued a statement. We made it very clear that we are opposed to the unbundling of Transnet because unbundling really doesn't fix any problems. There are entities that have been unbundled, but that are also imploding. So with that one, we remain very suspicious. We have expressed ourselves at Network. We have made it very clear at an alliance level that we remain opposed. But like I said, if you go to the South African Airways situation, we would have preferred that government kept 51%. But we also acknowledged that the airline was dead by then and workers were not getting paid. We had already considered with South African Airways that, of course, we needed to open doors for private sector involvement. It's the fact that that private sector involvement ended up being 51% that really became of concern for us, because we felt that going forward, government is likely to do what we saw being done at Telkom, where it was a good partnership, but government kept handing over piece by piece to the private sector. At the end of the day, it just became an entity that was prepared to fire engineers and go to China to outsource engineering work. So those are the problems that we have to deal with. On the issue of Denel, that's another issue. The reality is that when workers are seated at home and they are unemployed, you have to look at pragmatic ways of fixing the problem. And what that means is that you have to be open-minded to accept that there is a role for a private sector involvement. But that doesn't mean that government has to hand over everything to the private sector. For an example, with South African Airways, even in 2001, at some point, South African Airways used to be 30% owned by Swiss Air. So we do see a role for private sector involvement when it comes to Denel. But we hope that, and we insist, in fact, that government has to keep the majority stake while inviting the private sector to fix the problems.
Well, Somlomo Baba, we thank you very much once again for your time. We've heard everything you have to say. I will leave it to the viewers to decide for themselves whether indeed COSATU has lost the privatization fight. That's how we leave it. More news with my colleague, Nompumelo Seziba, at the top of the hour. Your weather details up next.